What happens when privilege collides with justice? Watch as an arrogant socialite faces a no-nonsense judge and learns a life lesson she'll never forget. The courtroom was packed that morning, a low hum of anticipation rippling through the crowd as people shuffled into their seats. It was a typical day at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, except for one detail. This hearing had captured public attention. Tiffany Halstead, a wealthy socialite infamous for her reckless behavior and sense of entitlement, was about to stand trial. Across from her sat Judge William Grant, a man known for his unflinching fairness and razor-sharp mind. In the legal world, his name carried weight, a reputation built on integrity, not indulgence. Tiffany made her entrance as expected, late and unbothered. Drenched in designer labels and hidden behind oversized sunglasses, she strutted into the courtroom like it was a runway, not a court of law. Her attorney, noticeably tense, followed closely behind, whispering urgent reminders and hoping to downplay the spectacle. The courtroom, long accustomed to decorum, fell into a stunned silence. Every eye turned toward Tiffany. And so began a hearing that would become more than just a legal proceeding. It would become a reckoning. She stopped midway down the aisle, completely unaware, or unconcerned, that others were waiting for her to sit. With a casual flick of her wrist, she waved her lawyer aside, claiming the bench like a reserved seat at an exclusive event. Her entitlement was palpable. Removing her sunglasses with theatrical flair, Tiffany scanned the courtroom, her gaze indifferent, as though the entire scene was beneath her. Moments later, Judge William Grant entered. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The murmurs dissolved into a respectful hush. In his mid-50s, Grant was a commanding presence, tall, composed, with a steady air of authority. His sharp gaze swept the courtroom before he took his seat behind the bench. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Tiffany hesitated, annoyance flashing across her face. With a dramatic sigh, she stood, her expression practically shouting, "Why am I even here?" Judge Grant didn't flinch. Calmly, he adjusted his glasses, opened the case file, and began the proceedings. Tiffany's charges were straightforward. A string of unpaid parking tickets, and a recent incident involving reckless driving, an episode that nearly injured a pedestrian. Simple on paper. But the person behind the wheel made it anything but. What could have been a routine hearing was about to take a dramatic turn, thanks to Tiffany's unchecked arrogance. As Judge Grant began outlining the charges, Tiffany's body language shifted. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and rolled her eyes, an overt display of disrespect that didn't go unnoticed. But Judge Grant didn't flinch. He remained composed, his tone calm and precise, his delivery deliberate. It was as if he were giving her enough rope to hang herself, daring her to keep up the performance. The energy in the courtroom changed. A quiet tension settled over the room. Even the most seasoned court regulars sat a little taller, sensing that something was about to give. Tiffany, blind to the storm she was summoning, seemed determined to escalate. Her irritation grew with every word the judge spoke. She began tapping her manicured nails on the wooden table, sharp, rhythmic, and just loud enough to be obnoxious. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something in urgent tones, but she brushed him off with a flick of her hand, her face a portrait of disdain. The lesson she was about to learn wasn't in the law books, and it was coming fast. The already tense courtroom seemed to hold its breath when Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity. Without looking up, Tiffany muttered, "Yeah, that's me," her tone thick with indifference. A quiet murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Grant's expression remained composed, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than before. "Miss Halstead," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "In this courtroom, we maintain a certain standard of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, clearly unfazed. She leaned back in her chair, lazily twirling a strand of her blonde hair between her fingers. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Soft gasps echoed across the room. Even the court reporter paused mid-keystroke before resuming. Tiffany's lawyer let out a quiet groan and buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. But Judge Grant didn't flinch. "Miss Halstead," he repeated, his tone firmer now but still composed, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany rolled her eyes again, adding an exaggerated sigh. "Honestly, no. I mean, it's just some dumb parking tickets," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "And what, someone got scared because I hit the gas too hard? This is a waste of time." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. All eyes turned to Judge Grant as he slowly closed the folder in front of him. He removed his glasses with deliberate precision and placed them gently on the bench. For a moment, it felt like the entire room stopped breathing. "Miss Halstead," he said, his voice low and even, but carrying the weight of a gavel, "I would advise you to choose your words very carefully from this point forward." There was a shift in the atmosphere. Even the most casual observers in the gallery straightened in their seats. The gravity in his tone left no room for misinterpretation. But Tiffany remained unmoved. She shrugged. "What? It's true," she said, leaning forward with a smirk. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." What Tiffany didn't realize was that the courtroom was no longer humoring her. Her arrogance had crossed a line. Judge Grant said nothing. His silence now felt louder than any outburst. And what happened next, no one in that courtroom would ever forget. Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze locked on Tiffany. The room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Even Tiffany's lawyer, who had been nervously shuffling papers, stopped and looked up, tense and still. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" Judge Grant asked, his tone steady, almost conversational. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority beneath his calm words was unmistakable. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away a minor inconvenience. Judge Grant nodded slowly, folding his hands on the bench. "I see," he said, his composure unshaken. If anything, his stillness only made the tension in the room grow. The spectators leaned forward, anticipating what would come next. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Halstead," he said, voice firm and deliberate. "The charges against you include not only reckless driving, but endangering the life of a pedestrian." He paused just long enough to let the words sink in. The law does not weigh accountability by how dramatic a crime appears, but by the harm it causes. Whether or not you think it's a big deal is irrelevant. Do you understand that? Tiffany rolled her eyes once more, muttering under her breath, Sure, whatever you say." The whisper was barely audible, but in the thick silence of the courtroom, it carried like a shout. Judge Grant's expression remained composed, but a subtle shift betrayed the change. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the pause before he spoke. The room felt it. Something was about to shift. "Miss Halstead," he said, his voice still calm but noticeably cooler, "do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago? The one that brought you here today?" Tiffany shrugged, bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked. He moved. End of story." The judge raised his eyebrows. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she replied, folding her arms across her chest. "No harm, no foul." But Judge Grant wasn't done. He reached for a file on the bench, flipping through the pages with deliberate precision. Then, looking up, he addressed the room, not just Tiffany, but everyone present. "Let the record show," he began, his voice projecting clearly across the courtroom, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, was a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher." A few heads in the audience turned, visibly reacting. He was crossing the street at a legal crosswalk when Miss Halstead accelerated toward him in her vehicle. In the process of avoiding her, he stumbled and sustained a wrist injury. He looked directly at Tiffany. "That, Miss Halstead, is not no harm, no foul. That is endangerment." "He has since required medical treatment," Judge Grant continued, "and continues to experience ongoing pain as a result." Tiffany's smirk faltered for the first time. She glanced sideways at her lawyer, who leaned in and whispered something urgently. But she dismissed him with another wave of her hand. "I didn't hit him," she muttered under her breath. "He was fine." Judge Grant turned his full attention back to her, his voice calm but unyielding. Miss Halstead, does that sound like no harm, no foul to you? Before Tiffany could answer, the judge's tone shifted, just slightly, but enough to send a ripple through the room. What troubles me most, he continued, is not the nature of the charges, but your utter refusal to take responsibility for your actions. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Tiffany leaned back in her chair again, trying to appear unfazed, but the tension in the room was palpable. Look, she said with a roll of her eyes, I said I didn't hit him. People are so dramatic these days. Gasps echoed softly from the gallery. Even her lawyer closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. And Judge Grant, still composed, was now ready to make his point in a way Tiffany and everyone watching would never forget. Judge Grant tapped his pen lightly against the bench, the soft clicks echoing in the silent room. He paused, letting the moment settle before speaking again. Dramatic, he repeated, his tone still even, controlled. Would you like to hear from Mr. Lopez himself, Miss Halstead? He let the question hang. Because he's here today, in this courtroom. A hush fell over the room. The air grew dense with anticipation. Tiffany's confident facade cracked. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the gallery. There, in the second row, sat Mr. Edward Lopez. His arm in a sling, his posture upright, dignified. His weathered face bore no anger, only quiet disappointment. And somehow, that expression cut deeper than any rebuke. Tiffany shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. The boldness in her eyes had dimmed, but not completely. I'm sure he's fine, she muttered, though the defiance in her voice had faded to something weaker, uncertain. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly, his presence dominating the room. Miss Halstead, he said, voice low but resolute, your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But make no mistake, this hearing isn't just about Mr. Lopez. He paused, letting his words settle like a gavel strike. It's about the precedent we set, about whether privilege excuses recklessness, and whether accountability applies to everyone equally. When individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability, Judge Grant said, his voice steady, justice must remind them otherwise. The courtroom was so quiet, even the soft scratch of the court reporter's pen was audible. All eyes were on Judge Grant now, waiting for what would come next. Then, with a calm that only heightened the gravity of his words, he spoke. Since you appear unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, Miss Halstead, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand. Tiffany blinked. The confidence she had worn like armor began to crumble. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice carrying a note of real unease for the first time. Judge Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the bailiff, who stepped forward and handed him a small stack of documents. He began to read, outlining the official penalties, substantial fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training. But it wasn't just the punishment that struck a chord. It was the way Judge Grant delivered it. Every word carried purpose, woven with a message far deeper than any legal sentence. He spoke of privilege, of empathy, of what it means to live in a society where responsibility must not be optional, especially for those with the power to ignore it. Then, just when the courtroom thought it had heard the end of it, Judge Grant delivered his final decision. One that would not only shake Tiffany, but would ensure that her confrontation with reality could no longer be delayed or denied. Judge Grant set the papers down, his gaze steady and unwavering. The weight of what he was about to say seemed to settle over the room before the words even left his mouth. Miss Halstead, he began, his voice measured but firm, I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions and your blatant disregard for responsibility, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will address not only the legal violations, but, more importantly, your perspective. Tiffany straightened in her chair, her earlier flippancy replaced by a flicker of unease. Perspective? She repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Yes, Judge Grant replied, unwavering. In addition to court fines and 200 hours of community service, You will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the downtown women's shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have experienced real hardship, often through no fault of their own. He leaned forward slightly. Perhaps then you'll begin to understand the impact of carelessness and the burden of unchecked entitlement. A collective murmur rippled through the room. This wasn't a sentence anyone had expected. Some spectators nodded in approval. Others exchanged skeptical glances. But the most striking reaction came from Tiffany herself. Her mouth fell open slightly. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, her voice cracking with disbelief. But Judge Grant was not. And for the first time in that courtroom, it was clear. This was not just a punishment. It was a turning point. Her voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people? That's not my problem." Judge Grant's expression didn't waver, but his voice dropped several degrees colder. "Miss Halstead," he said evenly, "it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today." His gaze didn't leave hers. "Your actions reflect not just recklessness, but a deep lack of empathy, a refusal to recognize how your choices affect others. This is not merely a punishment. It is an opportunity for growth." He paused, then added more firmly, "And let me be very clear. Failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Tiffany's lawyer tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but she pulled her arm away with a scowl. "This is insane," she snapped. "You can't force me to do this." Judge Grant raised a hand, silencing her outburst with a single gesture. "This court," he said, voice like iron, "has full authority to enforce community service as part of your sentencing. You will report to the downtown women's shelter by 8 a.m. each morning. Your assigned supervisor will file weekly progress reports." He leaned in slightly, delivering the final blow with chilling calm. "Should you fail to comply, Miss Halstead, I assure you, you will be back in this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances." The room was silent once more, the judge's words hanging heavily in the air. This was no longer just a lesson in justice. It was a reckoning. Tiffany's face flushed with anger, but for once, she said nothing. She simply sat there, stunned and silent. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Grant's final remarks would leave a lasting impression, not just on Tiffany, but on everyone present. He adjusted his glasses, his composure unshaken despite her visible defiance. Then he let the silence linger, just long enough to draw in every ear, every eye. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but unmistakably powerful. "Miss Halstead," he began, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice, and when possible, to teach." He paused briefly, letting the words sink in. "Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for far too long. And in doing so, it has cost you something far greater than a clean record. It has cost you empathy." A hush swept through the room. "This is not about punishment," he continued. "It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Tiffany shifted uncomfortably. Her posture stiffened as she glanced nervously toward the gallery. The last of her bravado slipped further from her face. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, thinking better of it. Judge Grant leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked about how he felt toward you?" Judge Grant's voice softened, almost conversational. "Do you know what Mr. Lopez said when asked how he felt toward you?" Tiffany shook her head, her eyes flickering toward Mr. Lopez, who remained seated quietly in the gallery. His expression hadn't changed, still one of quiet disappointment. And somehow, that made it even harder to look at. "He said," Judge Grant continued, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand, because if she doesn't, she'll keep hurting people, and one day, it might be something she can't undo." The words hit like a hammer. Tiffany's face turned pale. Her usual composure began to unravel. For the first time, her defiance faded, replaced by something unfamiliar. Discomfort, maybe even guilt. Judge Grant didn't stop there. "Mr. Lopez, a man you nearly injured, has chosen grace over anger," he said, his voice steady. "He could have demanded harsher penalties, but instead he asked for something far more difficult to give, a chance, an opportunity for you to learn." Tiffany shifted again in her seat, her confidence visibly eroded. The room was silent, reverent. Every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, felt amplified. Judge Grant delivered the final instruction, his tone clear and unwavering. "You will report to the downtown women's shelter on Monday morning." Judge Grant continued, his voice steady but purposeful. "At the shelter, you'll meet women who have faced challenges you cannot begin to imagine. Some have lost everything. Others are clawing their way back, rebuilding their lives from the ground up." He paused, letting the words settle before delivering the heart of his message. You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you begin to understand the value of humility and the weight of accountability. Tiffany looked as though she wanted to protest, her lips parted, her brow tightening, but the gravity of the moment seemed to hold her tongue. Her lawyer gently placed a hand on her arm, silently urging her to remain still. The judge's words had begun to sink in, but the real transformation, if it was to come at all, would begin only when Tiffany stepped outside the protected bubble of her privilege and faced the realities that awaited her. With a sharp crack, the gavel fell. "This court is adjourned," Judge Grant declared, his voice firm as he stood and exited the courtroom without another glance. A tense silence remained, thick in the air, like the echo of a storm that had passed yet still left its mark. Tiffany stayed seated. Her face was a mix of disbelief and indignation, her once bold expression now clouded with uncertainty. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something urgently, but Tiffany barely responded. For the first time, it seemed, she had nothing to say. The gallery began to empty, the quiet shuffle of footsteps giving way to a rising hum of conversation. Onlookers murmured among themselves, still processing what they had just witnessed. Mr. Lopez stood slowly, his arm still secured in a sling, a visible reminder of the moment that had brought them all to this courtroom. As he passed by the defense table, he glanced briefly at Tiffany. His expression remained gentle, but firm. There was no malice in his eyes, only quiet resolution. Tiffany didn't meet his gaze. She kept her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, jaw tight, shoulders tense. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters and cameras clustered along the steps, eager to capture the fallout of a hearing that had turned a tabloid fixture into the center of a public reckoning. Tiffany's name, long associated with socialite scandals and flashy headlines, was now tied to something far more serious, a courtroom drama that had stunned even the most jaded spectators. The moment she stepped through the doors, the flashes erupted. She was flanked by her lawyer, who did his best to shield her from the barrage of shouted questions. "Miss Halstead, do you have any comment on today's sentencing? Do you feel the punishment was fair? What are your thoughts on Judge Grant's decision?" For a brief second, her familiar arrogance flickered to the surface. "No comment," she snapped, brushing past the crowd and disappearing into the waiting car. And just like that, she was gone. But the lesson she'd been handed, whether she accepted it or not, was only just beginning. But inside the car, the facade began to crack. As the doors shut and the noise of the reporters faded into the background, Tiffany's posture shifted, her shoulders slumped. For the first time, it looked as though reality was beginning to settle in. That evening, the story dominated headlines across every major news outlet. Clips from the courtroom, especially Judge Grant's powerful words, went viral, igniting widespread discussion. Social media lit up with opinions. Some praised the judge for delivering justice with compassion. Others condemned Tiffany's arrogance and lack of remorse. But the most powerful commentary came not from a journalist or influencer, but from Mr. Lopez himself. In a brief statement outside the courthouse, he said simply, "I don't want her to fail. I just hope she learns. Because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and that's when we truly lose." The simplicity of his words struck a chord, reaching far beyond the courtroom. But for Tiffany, the lesson had only just begun. Monday loomed ahead, bringing with it a world completely unlike the one she was used to. A world far removed from designer handbags, curated brunches, and curated headlines. What she would come to realize, perhaps for the first time, was that real change doesn't come from being told. It comes from seeing, from doing, from feeling the weight of someone else's reality, and finally understanding that it matters. Monday arrived with an unfamiliar chill for Tiffany, in the air and somewhere deep in her chest. She stood outside the downtown women's shelter, her oversized sunglasses masking the hesitation in her eyes. The building was modest, alive with movement as volunteers and staff bustled in and out. For the first time in a long while, Tiffany felt completely out of place. Stepping inside, she was greeted by the warm hum of voices, the clatter of kitchen utensils, and the faint scent of coffee and cooked rice. A woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor approached her, clipboard in hand. "You must be Tiffany," she said. Her tone was friendly but firm. "Welcome. Let's get you started." The hours dragged at first. Tiffany was assigned to the kitchen, prepping vegetables, serving food, cleaning trays. She kept her head down, didn't say much. The bravado she usually wore like armor was gone, replaced by quiet discomfort. But as the day wore on, something began to shift. She started to notice the things she'd never seen before, the gratitude behind each guest's smile, The effortless camaraderie among the staff, the strength woven into casual conversations about impossible struggles. Over lunch, a woman, young, tired, but warm, sat beside her. A single mother of 3, she shared her story in pieces between bites. She'd fled an abusive relationship, worked 3 jobs, and still landed here. But she wasn't bitter. She was hopeful. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of hardship. "You think you've got it all figured out," the woman said, her eyes meeting Tiffany's. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." That night, as Tiffany drove home, the silence in the car felt different, heavy, reflective. The faces of the people she'd met lingered in her mind, alongside Judge Grant's words. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was more to life than the world she'd carefully built for herself, a world of privilege, isolation, and appearances. In the weeks that followed, her mandatory service continued, and slowly, day by day, something shifted. She listened more, spoke less. The walls she'd spent years building began to crack, not all at once, but gradually, like sunlight breaking through a fog. By the time her sentence was complete, Tiffany stood once more in front of Judge Grant. But this time, she wasn't the same. She was quieter, more grounded, her voice steady but no longer sharp. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up on me." Judge Grant nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "The real thanks," he replied, "will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." As Tiffany stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly overhead. This time, she didn't rush to her car. She paused, breathed. For the first time in a long time, the world felt new. She carried with her a small but powerful hope, not just for a new beginning, but for a new way of seeing the world. Tiffany's journey became a quiet but lasting reminder that change is possible, but it requires humility, courage, and the willingness to confront our own flaws. So now, the question turns to you. What will you do today to open your heart and mind to the lessons life is trying to teach? If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection, growth, and the power of second chances.